We're live. Manfred, it's so awesome to have you on here. Where are you coming to us from today?
I'm sitting here in Austria, next to Graz. It's not far from Slovenia and from Hungary, so it's this corner. And currently, I'm here in the home office, and yeah, looking forward to chat with you a bit about domain-driven design and
Yeah,
NX and the plugin I wrote.
I could see kind of in your background there's like a domain-driven design to your office, maybe. Like there's the tree side, and there's the book domain, and then
Yeah,
you have like some, I don't know what those are, like some shelf domain over there. But yeah,
yeah,
welcome
that's a nice
Austin.
metaphor.
Yeah, it's perfect, right? Austin
Some people.
Austin's one of our engineers on the Lerna team. So welcome, Austin. And yeah, go ahead. Sorry, Manfred.
No worries. Some people even call domains vertices. So I think if I extend your metaphor, we have several vertices here. Yeah, like
Yeah,
it.
yeah, perfect. Your whole life is domain driven. I like it.
Everything is domain driven. Yeah.
I don't know, man. I'm interested to have this conversation. But yeah, let's wait for more folks to kind of funnel in here. We got Edition Addict. Welcome again. Welcome. Giles Ferrand, I think a new face. So welcome, Giles. Michael Hladkey, he was on the show last week. So always
Hi,
great to have
Mikey.
Michael on here. Hi, Michael. Stefan Haas, another familiar face. Welcome. But yeah, we're here. We're talking with Manfred. Manfred, in addition to domain-driven design, the other thing I associate with you is module federation.
Yeah,
So how is that going for you?
really fine. I
Okay.
mean, it solves a lot of issues a lot of my customers have. I remember quite early when I started to do Angular, it was in the beta phase back then. Huge companies asked me, how can we do something like microservices in the front end? We
Hmm.
want to cut it down into little tiny pieces
Yeah.
that can maybe be implemented by several teams. And back then, there was no good answer. We had a lot of workarounds like loading web components or using, but it was not a perfect fit. And now with module federation, we can neatly integrate several stuff into one application.
Yeah. Well, that it was definitely one of the things that was like the obvious next step when so when I first encountered NX, I was at this company and we were building like custom solutions essentially. So what we would do is we'd have our big monorepo that we used NX for. We got all of our libraries figured out and everything was in the monorepo. We made sure like all of our contracts said, you don't get source code because we have to give you like the whole monorepo. But what we would do at the end of the day was we just like build up these common modules and get them to a point where inside of NX we just kind of ship them out. So we'd create applications, take all the libraries that we had built before, throw them in the application, and we pretty much got to a point where later on in the development cycle, like some of our clients, we just essentially pull down some libraries, configure them around, and they'd be ready to go. Which before using this kind of solution, it would be like months of development to get that ready to go. But sorry, meandering tangent. The thing we always thought was like it would be so great to just have these modules live out there, like be deployed independently. And that way we could like, deploy independently. And that was always, I didn't know about module federation at the time. Obviously, this was probably like I don't know, like 2016, 2017. I don't know if module federation was really a thing at the moment, but yeah, that was like obviously what module federation is. So, right?
Hmm.
So
Yeah.
cool. We got a lot of folks here. Let's say hi to everyone. We got South Africa here. What's up, Kumozen? Welcome. Shimon, welcome. Philip Reach from Germany. Okay, that's close to you, right, Manfred? I always assume you're
Yeah.
German from the accent. I guess that's Austrian though. I'm sorry. I just
No
lump all
worries.
y'all together in the EU.
It's the same language. Germans would deny it, but technically it's the same language we speak
Nice,
here.
nice. Mark Dell, welcome, and Bill Odom.
Hey,
back
Bill.
again. So
Long
he's
time no
here.
see.
I know. I still remember Bill's CSS grid workshop at NGConf. I wasn't there in person, but I did it remotely, and it was really, really good. So, as always, shout out to Bill. Nacho Vasquez is here. Welcome back, Nacho. And from the Philippines, I think that's a new one for us. Welcome, Mark. Welcome, welcome. All right. Well, let's get started on domain-driven design. And maybe we could talk about, it feels like this may fill into Module Federation a little bit, but
Yeah,
I don't
yeah.
know. I'll let you
Totally.
drive that. Oh, another German here. Welcome, Camiar, and in Utah, Chris. Welcome. All right, let's go. All right, domain-driven design. So, Manfred, what is it?
Yeah, good question. What is it? Well, at the end of the day, it's a lot of things actually,
Okay.
because it has a lot of patterns and best practices in there for structuring a business application or in general an application you want to align with the real world, with the business domains out there.
Cool. So the idea, the idea as I understand it is like, well, like you mentioned, I guess there are business domains. Let's make sure the repo matches that domain. Is that the idea?
Yeah, yeah.
Okay. That
That's
seems easy
one way
enough.
to put it. That's one way to put it. So I would say the business, the domain drives your design. You don't have technical aspects that design is driven by. Of course, you have, but not mainly. Mainly, you have use case specific things that are driving your system or your design.
Mm-hmm. Oh, I see. So maybe it's like driven by domains as opposed to driven by use cases.
I would say driven by domains with use cases as opposed to driven by technology decisions.
I see. Tech concerns, maybe. So by
Yeah,
domains and their use cases.
yeah.
Okay. So, or is this how you define a domain then? Is a domain a set of use cases, or
Yeah,
is
yeah.
it something
I would
else? Okay.
define it that way. If we look at it from a bottom-up perspective, if we look at it from a top-down perspective, I would say the area you are writing your software for can be
Mm-hmm.
subdivided in several domains.
Okay.
And those domains should not know much about each other. Of course,
Okay.
they need to know a bit about each other, but not too much.
Right. So domains almost represents isolation of concerns, like almost like siloing is the idea.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
So domain should not, let's make that capital, not be inter-concerned. Interesting. Okay.
Mhm.
Did you have a slide that you wanted to show on this, Manfred, or do
Oh
you
yeah,
want to keep
yeah.
going before we
I
get into
can
that?
show you something about this. Yeah.
Cool.
So, where is it? Here it is.
Cool. It looks like,
Yes.
catching up to the chat here, looks like we got the Utah uh the Utah folks representing. So there's always seems to be so many software engineers from Utah. So yeah. Yeah, glad they can be boring together. So yeah. And welcome Mathura, welcome Diggs, BTW. But yeah, Manfred, let's jump to your slide now. Let's see what's going on.
Awesome.
Oh,
Awesome.
we're
Yeah. So,
recursing. There we go. That's better.
yeah. That's recursion. You
Yeah.
cannot understand recursion without understanding recursion, and this was the proof. Yeah.
Define recursion. It's recursive, right?
Yeah, yeah, totally.
Oh, wait.
So,
Okay, sorry, Mark. I saw your comment earlier. Now I get what you're saying. I apologize. Let's go back to mine. There we go. I fixed it. Apologies, Mark. But yeah, and Demetrius, welcome. All right, sorry. Back to you, Manfred. Let's
awesome.
see what's going on with the slide. So
Yeah, so this is the white eagle on the white background. That's why you don't see a thing. But with one slide, I just want to explain how we do domain-driven design, especially strategic design, which is about decomposing a large system into tiny parts, into
right.
domains, contexts, and how we implement it with Angular. So what we do is, first of all, after identifying the domains out there that are out there in the real world, the real world is where the pizza boy comes from. After identifying them, we just define one folder in the NX monorepo for each of them.
Okay.
Could be a folder that is grouping libraries, or just a folder that is one folder inside of your NX standalone application.
Okay.
And then there is a shared folder. For technical reasons, of course, we need to share stuff. There is a fancy term in domain-driven design. It calls it the shared kernel, which is just a fancy term for a place where all the stuff goes in that is used everywhere.
Yeah. Cool. Yeah. Kernel sounds intimidating, but
Yeah.
yeah, I think kernel. I think operating system stuff, and I have nightmares about my old C classes that I took in college. So, so yeah.
I feel you.
But yeah. Okay. So you kind of have with what you're showing on screen, you've identified, and these are not technical concerns. These are business-based concerns for booking and boarding. And then you have some shared resources, and the shared piece is technical. At the
The
end of
shared one is technically.
Okay.
It is not a real domain, but if we go to the implementation level, we treat it like a domain on the implementation level. On the logical level, it is just a necessary part because sometimes we need to share stuff.
Right. That makes sense. All right. Well, so we've kind of set up the two silos. I guess this is like probably looks like an airplane application or something like that.
Yeah, it's an example application we use in our trainings. It's about
Okay.
managing an airport.
Oh, neat. So what happens inside these domains then? Is that it? It's just like these are directories on your file system, and we're going to
directories in your monorepo, and then you fill them with libraries and X libraries or just further folders with modules. And the nice thing is here we are aligning with best practices from you guys, from Novel. We have something like a feature layer with smart components and an UI layer with dump components, a data layer with data access code and our model, and a utility layer. It is somehow nice because here we align with your best practices, but also with best practices of the domain-driven design world.
I see. So it's kind of like a marriage of the two. Yeah.
Yeah.
Let me just highlight Mark's comment here, because this is how I feel oftentimes. Like, I feel like this is often where I used to start, especially like if you go back a couple years, this is what I would always do, obviously, because we had recommended it. I feel like recently, though, I feel like I would almost when I said, this was interesting, I thought it was because each one of these that you have on screen here might be their own project. But no, this is a collection of NX projects. So, and you have the hierarchy here too, as you can clearly see from your slide. There's feature, UI, data, and then utils. So yeah, that's interesting. I feel like I've definitely gone more in the direction of lumping more of these together. Like in particular, like feature stuff with data fetching. For reasons similar to like what Mark has mentioned here, like between Redux or like if you're in the Angular world, it's going to be NGRX.
Yeah, totally.
It's kind of hard to share some of those resources, like some of the selectors. Like the idea would be probably you'd have like most of your NGRX stuff or most of your Redux stuff inside of data, but then you've got to have like other things know about it, and it needs to know about other things, and that's where things kind of start falling apart. I would imagine, given what you've showed on screen and what you've mentioned, the idea would be if there was, so often this comes up when there's intersection between booking and boarding? Like, obviously, you must have booked if you need to board, I would imagine, would be one of the things. So is the idea that shared works as the glue to keep those together, to connect those together?
Well, it can,
Okay,
but most likely it wouldn't, because booking happens in the backend. At the end of the day, it happens on the backend.
I see.
And that
Okay.
means the booking part of your application can somehow notify the boarding part. And if we switch over to boarding in the front end, normally we get the data from the backend, and it tells us,
Mhm.
hey, you have booked it, and now please make sure you enter the plane in time.
Understood. Okay. So, in the example we're looking at, are we only concerned with the front end of this application?
Yes and no. I mean, here
Okay.
we are just talking about the front end,
Mhm.
but this raises another awesome question, namely, how does this look like in the backend?
Yeah.
And for this question, there is no definitive answer, because it really depends on your kind of application. If you are lucky from a technical perspective, you have the very same verticals in the backend,
Mhm.
because that means you can subdivide a huge application into slices where different full stack teams can work on, if you are
Right.
lucky. If you're not lucky, this looks completely different from a backend perspective.
Right.
Let me just give you one example.
Mhm.
Payroll accountancy. It's quite difficult from a backend perspective. You have a lot of rules and laws and so on.
Yeah.
So you will very likely have a lot of domains there.
Mhm.
And from a front end perspective, in let's say 80% of the use cases, it's easy. It's
Yeah.
about telling the system that this person gets this amount of money at the end of the month
Yeah.
if I'm in good mood.
Yeah. So the front end gets it easy in that scenario because essentially we just use one of these data libs. One of these data libs is going to have, how do I get that information? Who knows how that's coming from the back end? All the front end needs to know is like, give me the URL or give me the network request I'll need to call in order to get that information. So cool. We do have some questions here. Do you want to go through some of these, Manfred?
Yeah, of course, of course.
Cool. Let's highlight this one first from Edition Addict. Can you see it on the screen here? Otherwise, I
Let me
can.
switch over,
Yeah,
which will
let's
give us
switch
some
to this.
recursion.
There we go. So we don't see the recursion. So okay, so what it confuses Edition Addict the most is on-site collecting data has very different concerns from admin validating the same data, but they all share that same data. I
Hmm.
I would imagine the idea here would be the interface for this data and maybe the utilities around that data might exist in some shared domain. And then this particular use cases for collecting or validating, those would have, they would import from the shared resource and then do what they needed to do for their appropriate domain. Is that how you would
Yeah,
answer it, Manfred? Okay.
sharing is always an option, but
Mhm.
it's also the last resort.
Oh, I
Uh,
see.
Normally, we really try to not share stuff, because, on the one side, sharing is fine because it makes our code dry. This is what we learn in school when we learn programming. Dry is the first design principle, I guess every one of us learns. Don't repeat yourself.
Right.
However, Try has one drawback, namely it creates coupling. If I share stuff, then I create coupling to other stuff. And if we are in the situation where we have a huge system that needs to scale by slicing it into several parts, independent parts that can be implemented by autonomous teams, then coupling is also something we want to avoid. And
Mhm.
for this reason, being dry within your vertical is important. Being dry between your verticals is a trade off thing. So you need to discuss it if you really want to share it, or if you find other things. Like if it is just about data, it could be about message passing in the backend.
Yeah.
The booking part could just write into a message queue a domain event, something like, hey, someone booked a flight. And everyone who is interested, everyone in the sense of each and every other domain, can grab this message and do with the message what they want.
Mhm. Gotcha. Very cool.
So it's really about decoupling stuff, which is important if you have several teams. And perhaps one additional thought about this, this does not necessarily mean that you have redundancies, because very likely in different domains, you have a different view on the same data structures. A flight from booking is differently from a flight in boarding. When it comes to booking, we need a lot of information because we have to sell that flight. If it comes to boarding, it is perhaps just a number, a flight number, and we have to make sure that the right people enter that plane. We don't need this huge amount of information. So we have a different perspective.
Yeah,
And
you
it
have a
is
different
also
domain, so you have
perspective.
different needs from the data. Is what I'm hearing.
Yeah.
Okay. Cool.
And that's also another aspect of domain-driven design. Don't try to describe the whole world with one model.
Okay.
A nice metaphor, perhaps, for this is imagine a map that shows the railways, the roads for bicycles, where you have your water pipes, where you have the cables for power supply, where you have, I don't know, plane connections, plane roads. It is overloaded and no one will have any gain out of it because it displays too much at once.
Right. That makes sense. One thing that's like where I see a lot of friction between what you're describing as domain-driven design and one of the things I like about the way I like to program things is maybe the principle you mentioned, dry, like don't repeat yourself. You're saying, from what I'm hearing, you're saying often you may want to repeat yourself for the different domains for the purpose of these things not being coupled together. However, I often want to couple those things. I feel like, in particular, in a full stack scenario, I want a library to couple these things. Not that the front end and the back end are coupled, but that the front end and the back end are both pointing to the same TypeScript interface for the response body, for example. That way, if I make the change in one place, I don't have to manually think and like manually make the change to adjust that in the other place. So yeah, I don't know. It would seem though that in that situation, if we're following by domain-driven design, especially because these concerns like front end or back end, that's a technical concern, right? Would the idea be that front end and back end would likely live under the same domain if you're doing a full stack NX repo?
If you are lucky, then you can do it. Yeah, if you're lucky, you can do it. So if
I guess that's what it comes down to, right? Yeah. If you're lucky, that means your all your stuff's in the same monorepo, and your front end and back end teams will work closely together. Is that what you mean by if you're lucky, or?
Yeah. And if you have one vertical spanning from the back end to the front end, if you have a different slicing in the back end than in the front end, then it's not that easy to have one autonomous team to just work on one part.
Right. That makes sense. I mean, I feel like that would make more sense too if things were like living in those verticals. I think verticals is the name we would use at NX for what you describe as a domain. So so that's cool. But yeah, this is an interesting question because this is what I often think. Event-driven design or event-driven architecture is where I tend to prefer things. Like, I really like NGRX for this reason. I really like Redux for this reason. I really like actually event sourcing on the back end for similar reasons. And part of the benefit to this is, in my perspective, is you don't need to worry about the domains mixing too much. But I don't know. Do you have any opinions here, Manfred?
Yeah, it's a great fit. So event-driven, message-driven architectures and DDD nicely fit together. Because if we go back where we said we describe a domain from the real world, if we look outside of the window in the real world, a lot of events are happening there. Someone is buying a product, someone is buying a flight ticket, someone is canceling your flight. Those all are events.
Right.
And if one domain is just publishing this event, then other domains can use them to react on it. And so the system will be synchronized with each other, or the paths
Okay.
will be synchronized.
Well, so in this scenario, I guess the events themselves, would they have to exist in the shared domain or the shared section?
Kernel.
Yeah, the shared kernel. Sorry, I forgot the word.
You can put it there if it is important for a lot of domains.
Yeah.
If it is not important for a lot
Oh, I
of
see.
domains, for just 2 or 3 of them, then you
Mhm.
don't need to put it there.
I see.
Then you can model it, and perhaps then you have a contract in the form of XML or JSON that is published somewhere.
Right. That makes sense. Yeah, I guess when it comes to these kinds of event-driven things, I guess the difference would be like almost a public event versus a private event, where a private event doesn't leave its domain. And a public event is something that other domains should be aware of and should listen for.
Yeah.
And in that case, I guess it has to live in the shared kernel, right? Or something,
Yeah,
some way
it
of
has to
listening
live.
for it at least has to be in the shared kernel.
Yeah, in the shared kernel, or as mentioned, perhaps we have something like a Swagger document or like async API document, which looks a lot like Swagger, or just XML or JSON that just describes the payload. And then both sides can generate the parts they need.
Oh, I see. That's interesting. Okay, cool. Well, let's keep moving through the questions because I think there's a lot of them here. We've got chat is really popping off here. So Austin, one of our NX folks, how do you determine boundaries between two different projects on the same level within a single domain feature? For example, between booking data lib 1 and booking data lib 2. That's a good question. So I think in the slide that you were showing, there was this case of there's multiple data libs or data access libs at that level. So when I could see the case where you just want one. In some, I could see an argument for that, but in your example, you had multiple. So curious about this, Manfred. What are your thoughts here on when to
That's
draw a
actually a
boundary?
good point. That's a good point. So technically, it's possible to have more data libs, especially if you have several, let's call it islands of data that don't affect each other. And you can have a bit more decoupling within the domain by tinkering several domain libraries. However, honestly, in most cases, you just have one data.
Gotcha. Okay, so in most cases, let's stick to one. In some cases, it might make sense to split the boundary. Cool.
Yeah, if you have several islands that are not interconnected or that are just interconnected by placing the same ID here and there, then it's possible, then it gives you decoupling. But yeah, most likely you will just have one data lib. And this is not the case with the other libs. In this sense, the data lib is a bit special because for sure you have several features. A domain with one feature is a bit thin. And for sure you will have more than one UI library and one than more utility library.
Makes sense. I think this question too, I think it leads into one of the questions we get a lot, which is what's the best practice for having projects? Like how many projects should you have? Should you split things up a lot or should you group things a lot? And well, we get that question a lot. My advice is always, if you're using NX, it's a lot easier to split them. So you can maybe lean towards splitting things up a little bit more than otherwise because you have generators to do it for you. In a world without NX, you're giving yourself a lot more work. So I would tend to go the other way. So NX enables you to be a little more granular more easily. And the more granular you are too, the more advantage you get from NX in terms of NX speeding up your stuff. Now, I actually don't think that should be a main concern for you. Like you should be thinking about how fast is this going to build as you're developing. I think you should be more focused on explicitly like how do I make a better experience for the user. I think that's where the most of our focus should be most of the time. But it is a concern I think, and it's like a small benefit maybe to having more granular libs. So, but at the end of the
Mm,
day, for me, it's like how does this affect the final product? How does this affect the user's experience? Most of the times, it doesn't matter actually, like where you draw your libs or not. So
yeah.
there's that. That's where I tend to go towards. All right, let's keep going with questions. Similar experience to Mark Dell at the moment, where I'm trying to move the team away from old-fashioned spas. At the moment, I'm slowly getting them to use a single lib. Uh, so yeah, so old-fashioned spas, so like the single-page application into lib. So trying to break things out. I think in particular, like this is where like when you're using the kind of you know uh, uh, architecture that you were showing in that one slide, Manfred, I felt like the way it works is like these applications just become shells that then import all those features, and their job is
Yeah.
just to wire things up. So
Yeah. Each little tiny rectangle could be one NX library.
mhm.
And if you do it in this very fine-grained manner, as you mentioned before, you get all the advantages from NX, like incremental testing, at least for the vertically incremental compilation. You can also activate it for buildable library on the rectangle level and all the other stuff. I think NX, the philosophy of NX really is about splitting stuff into libraries.
Yeah. And I think that kind of feeds into what Mark's saying here too. So like from going to monorepo from a spa world, so trying to keep things into a domain, but at the end of the day, the root source still joins it all. I think that's how a lot of these things work at the end of the day. Like to me, a lot of the times the application, like we said, it's joining all of these things together. If you've got a router at the application, that's likely where like you're taking all of your routes from each one of the domains or each one of the features and plugging them into your router. Or maybe your router has a way of like expanding like a sub router that you just import at the end of the day. So that's how that would happen. But this is also how you'd have to do it for your data level stuff as well. If you're using something like Redux, where you need to define, hey, here's how the reducers federate our one state object. So you do have to import them. Hopefully, at the end of the day, it's just a file that's like import reducer A, reducer B, reducer C, and like here's the name that they're going to be federating on the global object. But yeah, question for Manfred here. Trying to get my head around mono feature slice design with NX. What would be your key takeaways of all your experience? Also, what about Webpack elements? I actually don't know what Webpack elements are. Do you?
Mhm.
Okay.
I think he refers to Webpack Module Federation.
Okay. Googling it
Yeah,
now.
what is my key takeaway? Well, one key takeaway for sure is in order to find a nice slicing, you need to know a bit about the business. You need to have a look, and now you have to be really, really strong. You need to have a look at the business processes. You need to have to talk with business experts, because otherwise you don't find out how you can slice all these processes into pieces that can more or less live on their own, that can more or less be implemented in an autonomous way. This is one key takeaway. Another key takeaway, it's always about trade-off. I don't like to think in this is good and this is bad. I like to think in terms of this is more beneficial or less beneficial in terms of reaching our architectural goals. We just discussed this with try versus coupling. So you cannot have both. You cannot have the cake and eat it, you know. And
Yeah.
last thing is you don't have to be perfect, because there is never a perfect slicing. Just start with a good slicing and refactor it on demand. I think meanwhile, we all know that refactoring is part of the game. 20 years ago, this was not the case. Some managers really had a bad feeling if you told them we need to refactor it. I think nowadays it's more part of the game.
Cool. And some praise from Ilko here as well. So yeah, very cool.
Thank you.
What is FSD? About FSD, full stack development? Is that what that is about? I don't know.
I'm not sure. Could be
Okay,
full stack development.
cool. Yeah, NSWAG. At the moment, I'm using fast endpoints with NSWAG. DTO, I'm familiar with that API translation. I know about that. I don't know what NSWAG is in fast endpoints though. So,
I think it's Swagger, isn't it? Swagger
oh, is
for
it?
.NET or something,
Oh, okay.
generating the TTOs and the model and so on.
Okay, so that would be like a way of allowing these domains to still kind of know about each other without having a hard coupling, I guess.
Yeah, yeah.
Cool.
Of course, message passing is even better because
Mhm.
if you have a synchronous call, you are coupling yourself a bit, even though you don't know what's behind the HTTP facade. But I also know, or we also know that asynchronous communication can be difficult and you
Mhm.
cannot use it for everything.
Right. Yeah, asynchronous communication definitely makes things more difficult. So, here from Mathura. Welcome, Mathura. I usually create an API library in NX that has TanStack query hooks integrated with the API. This acts as a shareable data layer. Yeah, this is likely where I tend to go most of the time. So TanStack query is a great way of having it's pretty much like the essentially a cache of responses, a cache of really a cache of your data, a cache of your application data. So yeah, exactly. Works as a shareable data layer. So this is a way, well, at least in the context of domain-driven development, this could be your data lib, is TanStack query implementation that exports to your hook. Your hook becomes your public API, and your feature can then use that. So cool. Question from Aaron Yeager: is too much decoupling a good thing? What say you, Manfred? I'll leave this one to you.
Yeah, I think this brings us back to this idea of finding trade-offs. And of course, if you decouple it too much, then it's not a good idea because this might make everything more difficult for you. It's about finding, and perhaps this is more art than engineering. It's about finding the right amount of coupling. I would say if your goal is that 5 teams can work in an autonomous way, you need to have at least 5 pieces, 5 verticals that are loosely coupled to each other if they want to work in an autonomous way.
Right. That looks like a follow-up to that question. Wouldn't it be better to decouple things on an as-needed basis rather than over-engineer it from the start? Interesting
Yeah,
question.
over engineering is always bad. But if you know you need autonomous teams, then it is already on a need basis.
Yeah, that makes sense. So this is an interesting point here from Mark. Mark's got all the good comments here today, but yeah, this is an interesting case because I feel like, at least on the front end side of things, you mentioned like payroll is one that's really easy for front end, really hard on the back end. I actually feel like user information is usually kind of difficult on the front end because it's like a domain that's meant to be shared. Because obviously most of your features are going to be specific to your user. So how
Hmm.
does is a user at this point? Is a user does it belong in the shared kernel? Does it have its own domain? I feel like it likely doesn't because a user likely doesn't have a business concern, right? Or I guess they do in terms of like logging in and signing up. But most of the times, it's like the user's information is interesting context for all of the features. So, what's your answer there, Manfred?
Well, we could put it into the shared kernel, of course, yeah. And
Mm-hmm.
then you have another shared library everyone is using. Quite often, when doing domain-driven design, you have a lot of domains that can be decoupled. However,
Mm-hmm.
in the middle, you have some key data, some master data everyone needs.
I see.
And in those situations, yeah, going with a shared kernel is fine. Going with a shared REST API is fine.
Mm.
Uh, Asynchronous communication can be fine, but it's not always easy, especially if you need an immediate response.
Right. Cool. Let's keep going through these questions here. There's so many questions, y'all. Shout out to Addie. Addie's familiar face here. So yeah, welcome.
Thanks,
Welcome, Addie.
Eddie.
Great to see you here. Okay, more from Ilko here. I would read the NX at the enterprise. Try it in an empty repo. Like make a project overview with API calls using NGRX, all using the NX at enterprise for your exploration. But always start simple. When you see a feature you're going to use, make it a library. Yeah, I mean, so I believe Ilko is talking about our book about enterprise development that we came that book's rather old now. I feel like I think it came out right before I had joined the company. But this book is what describes sort of the different types of libraries you should probably look to have, which we saw in the different hierarchy from Manfred's slide there, with like there's features, and then there's UI component, or there's UI projects, there's data access projects, and then there's util projects. So yeah, cool. It's from Stefan here. Aren't you concerned that UI is allowed to inject stateful services, which would break the smart versus dumb component principle? Would you solve that with a custom ESLint rule or extract modules into a lib? This is an interesting question. In particular, yeah, well, UI, to me at least, UI components always, I never seem to use them. I'll just confess that. At least in Angular, I don't seem to use them because there's always a lot of I guess there's a lot of boilerplate. Sorry, Brandon, if you're around, but there's a lot of boilerplate around making a new component. Oftentimes, when you have the need for a UI component, that means breaking it out into a different component. So most of my components tend to be, feature components, I guess, where you're injecting stateful services into them, that kind of thing. But yeah, I guess to the question here, like this is the reason why we have the lint boundary, or the project boundary rules, lint rule from NX, which I imagine you're making use of, Manfred, in order to assert this kind of domain driven design, to really just to make sure different domains shouldn't depend on each other. If they do depend on each other, it should be in the shared kernel, right?
Yeah. So if I can go back to my slide.
Yeah, let's put it back up.
So to just finish the slide, we have those access restrictions here. It also aligns with the best practices from NX, and they allow us to just go top down here. And one domain is only allowed to use its own stuff and the shared kernel. And this enforces those boundaries. And Stefan is asking something that is a lot asked out there, namely, if UI is allowed to access data, and if data contains NGRX, is this a good thing? And the answer is no. UI should not directly access data, but sometimes UI need to access utility. However, it might be the case that UI needs to access some interfaces in there, because you might have a dump component displaying a ticket or an address. And that's why it's allowed that we have this error. If you want to avoid by design that UI is accessing NGRX there, then you need to subdivide this into further categories of libraries, namely one library with the models, just interfaces types, and another library with the rest. And in this case, only UI can access the models, but not the rest, like the store. Would be safe by design. However, in this case, you get another layer, another category of libraries. So one more time, it's a trade-off. But the thing is, this matrix is not a law of nature. It's a starting point. And if you say, well, a refinement like this is beneficial for me, just do it. Split the data layer up to several layers. Some people also have an own state layer, just with state management related stuff.
Yeah. So let's show here another interesting point from Mark. I'm never sure if the lib should control their own route of the application, or if the application should define it. I feel like I go back and forth depending on the week. Yeah. This kind of thing I think doesn't really matter too much. Like it kind of goes back to what we were saying with just the router. Like I think it makes perfectly fine sense for a feature to be contained inside of a route. Sometimes I don't think that does make sense, but if it is contained inside of a route, it would be nice for the features public piece to just be the router information, and everything else from that's private. If you can decouple things that way. So yeah. Addition attic. So this is definitely what we recommended in the enterprise book that we had put out originally, which was like the app is just the shell that essentially just pulls stuff in from features. Sometimes like you can even do like a feature lib that is a feature for the app. That app just imports that. You can definitely do that. So yeah, and it's some folks agreeing here with addition addict. App just lazily loads a feature shell. Yep, the shell has routes, and the shell can load all the other shells as needed. Yeah, in that case, like where you can do that, that's always great. So yeah, we need feature slice design. Got it. That was that question from way up here. I'm so sorry. We're so behind on the questions. But yeah, FSD. I thought for sure you meant full stack development. But yeah, feature slice design. That makes sense. Okay, now the questions are getting answered. Too much decoupling is definitely too much. Yes, I think by definition.
And too little is definitely too little. So it's all about finding the sweet spot, isn't it?
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Aaron Yeager, you're welcome. Thanks so much for coming through. Yeah, more praise for you, Manfred. If too much decoupling tells a story, though it would be hard to, I can see some use cases. If, for example, you would provide a project overview for several projects in one overview. Interesting. Yeah, I don't know. What is this about telling a story? I've seen some other comments about this too, but I feel like, I don't know. I don't think of these things. When it comes to the human experience, I often think about telling a story, yes. But when it comes to code, I actually think in terms of often what signals are you sending out? Like in sort of signal versus noise kind of plays into this a lot. So this is one of the places where NX really shines, is especially if you're used to it. I feel like Angular shines in this manner too, where if you're used to it, there's a lot of signals that are easy for us to recognize, a lot of patterns that are easy for us to recognize. Like, for example, in an NX monorepo, if you see a project sectioned off, there's probably a reason for that. Like that's kind of the signal that being sent out to the noise of like all the stuff going on. So yeah, that's kind of where I go for like how to section these things off. I imagine your file system is a great way of sending those signals too. And that's kind of, I feel like what you were talking about, Manfred, in terms of like just each one of these domains should have its own directory in terms of the file structure, right?
Yeah.
So
yeah.
let's maybe take the comment down. We can like look at Excalidraw here, maybe just talk about like file system, what that would look like. But yeah, let's see. Let's get this aligned to the left. So we would have here maybe some root, and then so this might be your domains, maybe. And then inside of a domain, so here's where booking would be, right? And then a sibling to booking would be boarding, I suppose.
Or yeah, something like this. Yeah.
Yeah, and then would shared be a would that exist here, or would you tend to put shared, like would you hoist that up?
Well, both has advantages and disadvantages. Normally, I put it into the domains folder, even though I know it's not a domain. However, on the technical level, it's really treated like a domain.
Yeah, that makes sense.
We have the same rules for accessing, or almost the same rules for the boundaries and so on.
Yeah.
Feature A, feature B, and so on.
Yeah. So as we kind of go down here, let's say like if booking is expanded, would the idea be look something like this?
Looks
or utils?
Yeah, looks good.
See, I guess the other option would be if we had booking here, we could have like features and then, oops, Lost my cursor there for a second. And then nest things inside of that. Do you have an opinion either way there, or?
Well, I think at the end of the day, it is not crucial for your project success. I
Right.
prefer the first way because here we have less nesting.
Yeah, I think that makes sense. Like if you're splitting things out to domains, having these things separated out, they're still sectioned out, but they're just flat inside of their domain. I feel like that maybe does reinforce this idea of this domain is holistic too, rather than features are separate from data, which is separate from all the other stuff. So yeah. Let's see. More questions here. The chat is hopping today. This is awesome. So
That's good.
yeah, so maybe this is what we were just looking at. Would you recommend putting stuff into shared or create technical subdomains, such as the shared kernel is growing too large? Oh, okay. So maybe this, I feel like Stefan's talking about, well, what do we do inside of shared? Like in particular, I would think you'd have some sort of flat thing here. So this would be like shared feature A, or are there domains inside of shared? How does that work? I mean, I guess if I'm hearing you right, Manfred, I feel like you would say you should keep shared as small as possible. So it should
At
be
least the use case specific stuff in shared, yeah.
okay.
Shared features, shared data should be minimized.
Mhm.
However, normally most of your components, think about the design system, and most about your utilities are indeed in shared. It's about technical concerns, and we need to share technical concerns. I mean, all of us are using frameworks, and those things are nothing else than an extension to our framework.
Mhm. That makes sense.
Yeah, and indeed, I have seen situations where people substructured the shared kernel
Mhm.
because they had that many shared stuff. I remember this bank that said, well, we need to implement a huge amount of similar applications. And that's why they had a lot of generic code in the shared kernel, which was kind of their own framework. They built on top of Angular, and with
Mhm.
their own framework, they were capable of building a lot of similar applications.
Yeah. Very cool. Yeah, let's keep going out here. So this was an interesting case that I think you had mentioned earlier, Manfred. Just because we started out talking about module federation, using libs per domain helps me scale out to easily then use module federation. So
Yeah.
cool. I'm curious, do you use the NX module federation generators when you do module federation, or do you set it up manually?
I have my own plugin for it,
Okay.
and it also works with the CLI, and that's why I'm still maintaining it.
Awesome.
But the NX solution is quite similar. I mean, at the end of the day, it's about configuring module federation and telling module federation, please load this or that from over there.
Gotcha. Very cool. Addie has a question around where does a shell component start and where does it stop? Does each domain carry its own shell? Are there use cases where a shell will be across domains? So this is interesting because I feel like the shell component or the shell project, maybe this is actually where you'd hook into concerns with module federation, correct? Maybe I'm wrong. When you're using module federation, do you tend to split out to each project has its own module, or would you tend to make it each shell for each domain would have its own module to be federated? Does the question make sense,
Mm,
Manfred?
yeah. Well, you can technically do both. I mean, domain-driven design is also a good foundation for module federation because
Hmm.
you need those verticals. You need to identify those verticals somehow. And if we have several applications for those verticals, one application per vertical, then it's even more important that those verticals don't know too much about each other.
Yeah.
And if the question here is about shell, it depends a bit what's a shell for you. For some people, the shell is just the application that acts as an envelope around the libraries that might be federated or not. And for some people, the shell is just an intermediate library that sits between your features and your application, making sure that the application does not need to know too much about the features that are 1 or 2 levels under it, beneath it.
Very cool. So Mark points out one example is the Angular Spotify repo. I actually haven't seen this one, so I'm not super familiar. Edition Addict says, with NGRX, I found success with having feature actions lib category and a feature state. So this is interesting because this is kind of like, to me, when it comes to NGRX, I can speak about this pretty well. I haven't touched it in too long, but yeah, when it comes to actions and actually selectors, I feel like actions and selectors represent some sort of public interface for your NGRX store versus reducers and effects tend to be more private. Like it kind of doesn't matter to anything consuming the store, like what's happening in those. They just need to know about what the actions are, how to get information out of it. So yeah, that's, if I use things, that's how I tend to separate things too, in terms of like how to separate them out into projects. So very cool.
Yeah, so what we are calling data layer here, some people split it up into several layers. Then they have their state layer, or like we have seen here, it was even more fine-grained, one layer or one library for actions and one for the rather, as you call it, private internal stuff of the store, like reducers, effects.
Yeah. Who cares how they're putting together the information? I just need to know how to get it. That's kind of how I end up there. Nacho says, I use the shell pattern for managing the routes of the different bounded contexts. Cool. Yeah. I feel like that makes sense. That definitely falls into domain-driven design. It seems like where context is a domain here. So cool.
Yeah, totally.
It's interesting to see there's a lot of comments here about how routing fits into all of this too. I feel like it's not a direct relationship, but yeah, like they tend to align with each other. So if a feature controls all of its children route, I feel like it should just like export its router. If we're talking like an Angular context for the Angular router, then at the top level app or like whatever its parent is, you use the router to import that sub router. So that makes that makes things easy. Yeah, more praise for you, Manfred. Thanks, Stefan.
Thank you. Yeah, thanks for those great questions.
I know we've got some more here too. Another one from Camiar here. So he asked a question before about event-driven architecture. So dispatching events in front end can be hard because services should be singleton ready for different events. In this way, it can make some complexity. Is there any solution for this? So interesting.
I'm not sure why having singletons is an issue here. I mean, the event itself is not a service, if this is the source of the question. The event itself is just a data structure I'm putting somewhere, I'm sending out, I'm putting it into a message queue or a topic, or I'm sending it out with another service.
Yeah, this is where I tend to depart from a lot of, well, I guess for a lot of Angular common practices where you use like a service with shared state to manage these things as a singleton. I think if I'm going to be using Angular, I could probably still do it. It's been a while, but I could probably still do it. I would definitely, or at least my tendency would be to use NGRX as a way of managing state across all these things, because I don't need to concern myself with shared state services. I can just think of, well, I like the idea of having everything go into like the global store, and that can be sectioned off itself. Like it actually doesn't really matter to the components. The components don't need to know how it's sectioned off. They just need to know about the public interface, which is, like I mentioned before, what are the actions that I can perform and how do I get information out of the store? That's all the components need to know. And when you do it that way, I feel like your application actually is pretty much your NGRX layer. Everything else is like view on top of that. So So yeah,
That's a good point. If you go all in with NGRX and the Redux pattern, then NGRX might be the public interface of your data layer or state layer, as you want to call it. Not NGRX, but your building blocks you build with NGRX, like actions and selectors.
Yeah. Things get weird with that too, though, because you can say, do I have a project for all of my actions and all of my selectors? And is that just one project, or should we section those ones out by domain too? And I actually, I feel like I would tend towards just having a single public one for all of my data layer for an application. So combining all the different domains there, but just in the sense of exposing a public interface there. I actually think that all of the private sections of NGRX, like the reducers is on purpose trying to separate these things out into a specific domain. And that's part of the strength of NGRX is you can actually look, if you look at like a lot of, I think like NGXS has this problem where a slice can only know about its own actions. I think that's a mistake. Every slice should be able to listen to all the events, which is why I like having them in a single project. As a way of knowing all that kind of stuff. So yeah, that's where I tend to go with that. There's a question for me. Okay, let's see. I'm trying to get out of concepts which refer to as code and would argue that as we develop, okay, this is going back to stories. Sorry, we're so behind in the comments of this from like 10 minutes ago. But yeah, trying to convey story information into human consciousness. Yes, I think that's awesome. All right,
now I understand the term story too, and I think this really fits nicely to what we are discussing here, because if we look at a domain in the front end, then it's also driven by a story, by a user journey, and it might be one chapter of the story. And another domain might be a different chapter. First of all, in the first chapter, I need to book my flight. I'm stressed out because time is running and flights are getting more expensive and more expensive. And then I'm done. I'm relieved. And if I move over to the second chapter, then I'm arriving at the airport. I need to check in somehow myself, my luggage. I need to board and so on. So yeah, I like this metaphor.
Cool. Very cool. Yeah. NX is amazing for this. We use the iDesign approach with NX. So I don't know what iDesign is, but that looks like interface. That's like what's the right word I'm looking for? Convention for an interface. You always start with an I. I think that was like the recommended convention for TypeScript for a while there. But yeah, Manfred, we're actually at the end of our time. Like we actually, Manfred and I had intended to go into the plugin that he had developed and like live code through some of it, but we've had so much interaction and interesting conversations in the chat. I think this was a good use of our time personally. How are you doing on time, Manfred? Do you have a hard stop here? Or do you want to keep going through these questions till we get to the end?
So I'm flexible today. So if you want to stay a little bit longer, then we can answer the questions.
Sounds good. Let's keep going through the questions then. So Addition Addict with another question here. For a larger number of domains, would you recommend multiple shared kernels, say 2, but have a lot shared, but not with other domains? So this is an interesting question because this was kind of like what Stefan had asked before. But
yeah. So indeed, I had this situation where we had a huge shared kernel with a lot of technical stuff. And there we subdivided the shared kernel into several parts. We didn't call it shared kernel 1 and shared kernel 2. We found some nice names. And those names even helped us to define module boundaries, because not everyone should access everything, because in this case, everything is intermingled, and then you change something here and break something there, or team 1 changes something here and breaks the efforts of team 2 over there.
Cool. Yeah, we've got other folks trying to figure out what iDesign is. So it seems like a mystery. We'll see if we can figure it out. But yeah, so Mark usually does domain/feature, then UI with component tests, interface, Lambda, and fetch. Interesting. So yeah, and fetch with E2E. That's interesting. So one of my takes on this, is that I think when it comes to testing, I am so all in with end-to-end testing as the most important, and probably like the only one that gives people real value is actually where I end up on this, because at the end of the day, I think your testing suite should withstand any kind of refactor from a domain driven design to some other type, or just we're going to change where projects get drawn, like the project lines get drawn, or even where just like component lines get drawn. I think those sound like refactoring events, and to me it seems like you should have a test suite that just tests the user as the interface for whether all these things work together. So I don't know. Do you have any opinions here on how testing comes into domain driven design, Manfred?
Yeah. So of course, normally you have both, but I think we have also learned in the last years that the traditional testing pyramid does not really work that nicely in the front end. I
Mm.
mean, it's more or less clear that it does not work that nicely because unit tests work the best for logic. So if you are implementing a huge amount of logic, technical logic or use case specific logic, calculating something, deciding on something, this is very chance. However, if you have a CRUD-based application, then perhaps you get more benefits out of end-to-end tests. Yeah, and that's why people are challenging those testing pyramids with something like this here.
Yeah,
It's
like
rough.
the testing trophy. This is something that Kent C. Dodds talks about a lot. Shout out to Kent. He does awesome stuff. I
Mm,
actually think as time goes on and as tools get better and as processing gets better, we'll actually see the testing pyramid actually completely invert. I feel like what the testing trophy is we look at it, it's like uh, a pyramid that got sort of distorted a little bit, and I think it's actually part of a process to flipping over to where end-to-end tests are the thing that matters the most. And in my opinion, the thing you get the most value out of. And with some tools like that I like to use, like Playwright, and I actually really like Supabase for this purpose of having a database layer that is completely like the way Supabase works is you just have a Docker image that you run locally when you're developing. So you have complete access. It's a closed circuit with all these things. There's no outside pieces, no outside systems, including like for authentication and stuff like that, that you have to incorporate. So you can actually have a fully contained system do full end-to-end tests pretty easily. And
mhm.
NX, some of the cool stuff we're working on in cloud with distributed task execution, a great way of parallelizing those end-to-end tests that might take you longer before. Now you can actually parallelize them much better so that, while if you wanted to, you could make each individual test a target and then just send them at DTE, and DTE can parallelize them real good, like as optimally as you can, really. So yeah, that's real cool. Den DP, another familiar face. Always like seeing the dog in danger here as your avatar. What is the best way of creating configurable feature library? I want to configure it in the shell via routing configuration or something similar. For
Mm.
me, if you can do like, I'll let you answer it too. Actually, Manfred, why don't you take your first stab at it? I've been talking too much.
Well, perhaps it would be the same answer.
Okay.
Um, what I really like to do is I'm going with the patterns we know from Angular.
Mhm.
In the times of modules, ng modules, I provided something like for root for child to configure my library. Nowadays, I'm providing a provide function that takes the configuration. It really looks like the router module where we have provide roots and we put in a configuration object.
Cool. Yeah, that makes sense. So that's a common pattern, I guess, in Angular. I guess for me, what I actually like for these feature libraries, whenever I can, it's either to export like just one single thing. Sometimes that's a component, like sometimes a feature is a component. Other times a feature is like a route, where it's like some nesting or some branching kind of component or experience. So that's how I like to do my feature libraries, where they just have the one thing, either a route or a component, and then whenever you put it into whatever you're going to call it, your shell or into your application, you just import that one public piece and stick it where it needs to go, or put it into its parent feature or its parent route, however makes sense. But yeah, okay, the questions keep coming. This is awesome. I love it. But yeah, boss mode activated. I think that's for you, Manfred.
Oh, wow.
Boss mode right here. Addy has his own plugin. Hold my beer. Okay.
Nice.
I know Addy was working on a new plugin for stuff. Particularly, I think Addy has his own stack that he was working on, and a way of like putting all these different things together, which I think NX is really great for. If you look at some of the stuff we've been working on, the new create project feature, it's a generator that we have now. It's a great way for using NX actually like as your CLI. And you don't even need to call it NX. Like that was kind of the point of a lot of that effort. Is it prior to this effort, if you wanted to like use a plugin, you'd have to say npx create NX workspace, and then you'd have to do -- preset equals Addy stack or something like that. But now with what we have set up, it gets you like right out of the box. As soon as you run the generator, you can publish right to npm, and then all you have to tell your users what you got to do is write npx create Addy stack workspace or whatever you want to call it. And people don't need to know it's NX. That's kind of the point, I think. So yeah. Stefan, another question here. Percentage wise, what is your observation? How many companies are actually implementing module federation or micro? This is not module federation. This is micro front ends. Wild guess, only 10%. Is this? I bet it's lower than 10%. But I'm curious about your perspective here, Manfred. You may have better insights than me.
Yeah, it's for sure the minority. I think real micro front ends only make sense if the application is that huge that you have several full stack teams working on it. And those full stack teams need to isolate them somehow. If you have just 3 full stack teams and they are confident with working together in one mono repo and with sharing stuff in there, it's completely fine. But if they need their own release cycle, if they have different knowledge, then it makes a lot of sense if you have something like micro front ends, if those are a lot of different teams. And usually we find such projects in the area of banking, in the area of insurances, in the area of industry, perhaps where you have to have one application covering a lot of kinds of machines, and each and every machine needs one full stack team to cover the needs of this machine or this technical product.
Yeah, I think it's definitely an interesting case. I really don't think, for the most part, it's probably about 10% that could make a interesting argument for micro front ends. But I think the ones that are actually using it right now, I bet is like below 1%. Honestly, that would be my guess. So,
and I would really avoid it if I don't need it, because with micro front ends we get runtime integration. We implement our stuff in an autonomous way in different teams, and then we integrate this stuff at runtime into one common thingy into our shell. And runtime integration is always difficult because you cannot predict what you will get. So if you only have 1 or 2 teams, then the drawbacks might be higher than the benefits. If you have a lot of teams, then it might be the other way around.
Right. Cool. Another one from Stefan here. How do you keep a good action hydrant in a facade that is using an NGRX? Here's my answer. Don't use facades. That's my answer. But I'll let you answer too, Manfred.
So my answer is also, if you go all in with NGRX, then the facade might not add that much benefit. If you only use NGRX partly, or if you have a more lightweight store, then you might want to have something on top of your store that controls that only valid stuff goes in. And how to keep a good action hygiene. Yeah, I try to not export my actions to other domains. And this makes sure that the action is only used where it's defined.
Yeah.
Of course, before we talked about something like a public event. If you really need something like this here or there, you can make it public. I
Yeah.
mean, those are all rules of thumb and not laws of nature. So you can ease those rules a bit for your needs.
Yeah. Yeah.
Or you could just expose a part of a facade for other domains. And then what happens behind this facade is not the business of the calling domain. It's in implementation detail.
Gotcha. Yeah. Yeah. I think there's a lot of different ways. So yeah. Who has actually read and understood the Evans book? What's the Evans book?
It's the original book about domain-driven design.
Okay. Let me look this up. Have you read this?
Yeah, several times.
Okay, cool.
And I agree, it's not that easy to read, and it's not that easy to find out what he meant. Nevertheless, it's the original literature. It's the first book on this topic, and it's still a bestseller. So if we look at the number of sellings, at the rank, I think it's still under the top 10 or 20 of its category. So I think we should value this book. And of course, this book is what you reference to because it's the original literature. However, honestly, there are further books since then that are easier to comprehend. I would recommend books of, the name is difficult for me. Vern, is this a name in English?
Vern?
Yeah.
Vern.
So
sounds like a last name. Vern. Julius Verne. Didn't he write like is he a famous author?
I show you the book and you tell me how you would pronounce it in the right way in English.
Okay.
Domain-driven design. Some people refer to it as the Von Vernon, yeah. Vernon. Let me put it into the chat. So I would recommend this here from him. It's domain-driven design distilled. And the good thing about this book is it is easy to comprehend. And it also focuses on the important parts. It does not tell you a lot of different things. It really focuses on the parts you normally need.
Yeah. Looks like the link got kind of mangled inside the chat, but you can see the title there: Domain-Driven Design Distilled by Von Vernon. Okay, got it.
Yeah.
And yeah, Julius Verne. Yeah, he did 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea. I think he did like Around the World in 80 Days too. So yeah. But yeah. Yeah, cool. People are enjoying the podcast. We can tell. There's so many comments and conversations here. So this is awesome. Thanks everyone for coming. So how also to deal with environment TS concept in domain-driven design. This is an interesting one. In particular, it's interesting how this works with NX projects in general, because I imagine Dan must be coming from Angular kind of environment or Angular kind of background, because that's where environment.ts files get used. The idea here is that like you'd have a dev development.ts file, and then you'd have like a prod environment.ts file. And the idea would be you'd set it in your configuration for when you run the build, like which of these files do I work with? It's actually a really great way of doing this, but that's assuming that you only have like one node, like there's only one application or one module that's using this. And NX is all about saying, hey, like here's a bunch of projects. Let's separate this thing out into projects. In order to do that, you've kind of got to do something where you either have like an environment project itself. I imagine that would live in the shared kernel, correct? Or
yeah. Perhaps a service in the shared kernel that can be injected where needed. Or if you have this for root, for child, provide XYZ pattern, then you could just pass forward the keys from this service that are needed in there in this module.
Yeah. I think the way I would always do this is like I would have a project that did this for me. And then at the end of the day, what I'd be doing is like taking all of the variables inside of there, like exporting an interface and a way to get those that information, but then like sticking it into a script tag inside of your HTML really at the end of the day. So that's how I would do it. It's a bit convoluted, but it makes it work. I know there's other good solutions there around there too. Okay, let's keep moving on. Manfred, we're getting to 20 minutes over. If you have to get out of here, let me know and we'll shut it down.
I'm fine.
Okay,
I
cool.
don't have any plans for today.
Cool. So yeah, Mark Dell, putting E2E around the fetch in NX works so great. Interesting. So I'm curious what this means around the fetch. I imagine this must be like a fetch library. So this is a way of like, I think Manfred would probably put this as a data access kind of lib. So
Yeah,
that's what it sounds like, right? So I won't run the end-to-end test unless the Lambda interface or fetch changes. Okay, I think that makes sense. I'm
Oh yeah, that sounds a lot like incremental testing, incremental compilation.
Cool.
And X is really good at this, isn't it?
Yeah, it's really great. That's kind of what it's there for. And yeah, he's eager for Cypress to add their own visual testing stuff. That's cool. I have moved mostly to Playwright. So NX has its new Playwright plugin that we support now. So yeah, that's kind of where I'm going with my stuff. But Cypress is still a great option. I think it's a matter of preference probably. So whichever you prefer to use. But yeah. Hunis mentions it's off topic, but we are not going to avoid your question. We're going to dive right in. Is it really always a good idea to create a separate library for each feature or domain? Doesn't that reduce the speed of the CI? That's an interesting question. I think with NX, having more libraries actually will increase the speed of the CI, or like decrease the time, because the way NX works is like we're building a project graph for you, like just looking at your source code, taking all those, like analyzing it, looking at all the import statements and just putting a graph together that way. And we'll be able to tell definitively like what's going to work and or how these projects depend on each other. So yeah, there's that. I'm actually running against a hard stop. I forgot. I have to go pick up my kids in about 5 minutes here. So let's see if we can get in some more. So Den, to this point, we intended to, but chat has been so active. We've just been going through questions. Manfred, maybe reach out to me afterwards. If you want to do a live coding session on this at some point in the future, I'd be down. It's been a really interesting conversation. It would be awesome to see this solid, like in code, and get away from the abstract. So let me know. We can look at that too. Yeah.
Let's do it. Let's do
cool.
this. Let's
that sounds
schedule
awesome.
another date for it.
Okay,
so
cool.
The short answer is if you look up the README of this library, and if you try out the commands in there in a new NX project, then you see immediately how this matrix we've seen before is now translated into your NX workspace. So just create a new NX workspace and try out the commands in the README, and Bob should be your uncle.
Yeah. I like where you're going with that, Mark. Maybe Cypress is better for you. It's up to you. But this pieces about Playwright I really like. And yeah, like Addy, let's leave up Addy's stuff here for the ending out the stream. Thanks everyone for coming. Thank you so much, Manfred, for coming in, giving us all this time, answering all these questions.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, this has been awesome. So thanks everyone in the X community. Be sure to check out the Slack. And yeah, we'll see y'all again pretty soon. Next week we'll be doing something with a new NX release. That's kind of a little spoiler. So if you were here listening, you heard it here first. But yeah, new NX release coming out next week. And yeah, we'll see you then.